wide, slid the cutting edges of the blade into the darkened cave that was once an object of so much affection, and closed her eyes. She waited, her breath slow and measured. The whistle of a train, miles away at the edge of the bay, but its sound carried east by playful winds, reached her in that empty, noiseless house, and she held her breath. Her fingers tensed inside the two metal loops. Her scalp pulsed with ache and anticipation. By the time the train's song faded and the house reclaimed its eerie silence, Rose had clamped shut the polished blades of the scissors and placed them on the basket of bamboo. A single strand of errant hair clung to the keen point of the closed blades. She was alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you. So, Nairi, have you ever seen any crazy tourist traps in your life?
Well, the Winchester Mystery House is kind of a real tourist trap because the walls and the doors lead to nowhere and the windows. But thankfully I was on a tour, so I didn't actually get stuck in there.
Nice. Nice.
Crazy.
If you're feeling a bit lost here among all of these MPW people, we're the Master Professional Writing Department. We're a creative writing degree at University of Southern California. We have many faculty, students, and alums here tonight. How about faculty? Would you mind just raising your hands just quick? If you have any questions, please feel free to ask the many of them here. And who are our alums that are here tonight? Thank you all for coming out and supporting us. It's great. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so Erin LaRosa is in her second year with a fiction concentration.
She took a road trip with her family to North Carolina when she was 10. Her dad picked up homemade deer jerky as a snack at a Divey gas station. An hour later, they all had food poisoning and had to turn the car around. They never made it to North Carolina.
The strangest tourist trap that Erin encountered on a road trip was at a diner in Florida that boasted gator pie. She stopped because what does that even mean? Basically, an alligator meat pie.
You may not know that Erin is a redhead.
And we're proud to introduce to you Erin LaRosa.
Hello. I wrote this story actually while I was in Prince Gomobilis' class. It's a funny but true story, so I hope you enjoy it. When I was in high school, my cousin Stuart had a dream. He wanted to be on Survivor, the reality TV show, and he needed an audition tape to submit to the network. He eventually decided that I should film him playing a game of chess because that would be the pinnacle of sophistication. "It's all about strategy, honey. Do you understand?" he asked me in very heavy Southern drawl. I nodded. Yes, I understood. So we went into my dining room and set the scene for this video. I decided to create the type of mood lighting that was reminiscent of nighttime Survivor mode. So, thank you. I grabbed one of my mother's antique lamps and threw a kitchen towel over the bare bulb. Perfection. There Stuart was, at the head of the table, in a crisp white polo, his hair parted straight down the middle and gelled stiffly to the sides of his head. He looked not unlike a chic howdy-doody, and he swiveled in the chair so that only his right side was facing me. "Are you getting my good side on that camera? And you know what side I'm talking about," he said. I made sure to film exactly as Stuart wanted me to, and as part of his shtick to appeal to the producers, he had written a line that he was convinced would win them over. "Winning is about strategy," he said, and then dramatically would knock over a chess piece. "Checkmate." Everything was going fine until mid-one checkmate when I heard Stuart say, "Why does it smell like campfire in here?" I sniffed, turned toward the smell, and saw that the towel that I'd thrown over the bulb was now sparking with flames. I grabbed a non-burned edge, ran out of the dining room to the front door, threw the towel on our wraparound porch, and began to stomp on it with my sneakers. It was a move that I'd seen done in movies or when people wanted to put out their cigarettes. All you need to do was just stomp, and the fire would go out. So once I had stomped enough to convince myself that it was indeed out, I went back inside. A half hour later, we had finished filming, and I was walking Stuart out the front door when I looked over to where I'd thrown the evidence. I saw a hole burn through our porch the size of a beach ball. A panic came over me.
Museum in New Zealand. He still doesn't know why he stopped.
You may not know that learning to write and speak Spanish led Breen to a deeper love of English and strengthened his desire to write.
Ladies and gentlemen, Breen Murphy.
Thank you, Tom and Nairi. I was hearing all the stories and I'd forgotten what my place was that I stopped at, and then I remembered the sheep shearing farm. Who could forget? The scars that I feared. Some memories of my father remain. I have a hard time envisioning exactly what he looked like, outside of his long sandy hair and his wide smile with the tiny, evenly spaced gaps in his teeth. But I can still see perfectly his mangled left hand as he guided me out to sea on a mango-colored boogie board. Because he couldn't grasp the rails with it, he was relegated to pushing me out in the water. The cypress trees above the sand of Maikahana Beach shrank as the further out we got. And the color of water changed as we pushed through the waves, from sandy brown to light green where I could see the bottom, and then, outside the surf zone, the water was deep blue, and I wondered what was below. I lost my father when I was 8. He went missing out at sea in a mad attempt to recreate the Hokulea's journey, so some say, chasing the constellations out on the open ocean from Hawaii all the way back to Tahiti. He loved to track stars, would talk about it with my grandfather, Snowy, and there were times when my father would be gone the entire night. Snowy said he was chasing stars. I remember those nights, but I never recall him building any outrigger canoes, not even with his best friend Jason. I'm not sure he died at sea, but that's not based on fact. When my dad disappeared, my grandfather, Snowy, broke down, kept with the madness, and stopped speaking anything but gibberish. He wandered the beaches during the nights and cursed the ocean, scaring the rich homeowners near the water or the vacationers that rented those houses. He had to be helped, and the only place around with the psychological services was Honolulu. My mom's accompanied Snowy to town, probably thought that he needed the supervision more than me. My dad's best friend, Uncle Jason, became my Hanai father for that year. I told my mom I would have preferred to move to Honolulu since I was smaller and whiter, and therefore bullied at school, but she needed a break from where her son reminded her of her lost husband. Then I told her the truth, that Jason scared me. But she only laughed at my complaints. Jason had always been kind to me, even if he wasn't outgoing. He exemplified the standard type of accepted haole that lived full-time on the north shore of Oahu, or as everyone here called it, the country. He was a surfer who earned a living doing blue-collar work. He was a plumber and a handyman for the Turtle Bay Hilton and the locals around the country. His shoulders were broad and defined, and, along with his balding head, were tanned and freckled by the sun. He spoke in a low roll, which could easily be misheard as pidgin, but he was articulate and sometimes funny. Although even in jest he rarely smiled and never showed his teeth, the only physical manifestation of humor involved a minor curl at the edges of his mouth and a softening of his hard brow. And he possessed a gravity drawn from the intensity of his blue eyes that had the chromatic volatility I had only seen in the ocean. Intimidating for sure, but what scared me was a scar. The cicatrix was only a light purple sliver, the color of guava pulp, that extended over the round in the corner of his jaw. Jason said it happened from an accident, but never elaborated. I had to learn the origins of his scar from second-hand accounts and cobbled together rumors. Jason lived in Kuku, down the street from my family's old place, in a simple one-bedroom house with a small backyard that functioned as his workplace. The paint was chipped, but he cared for the house much better than most. He never let the doors warp, the metal fixtures weren't that rusted, and he kept the windows clean, no small feat with the salty humidity of the air. Because there wasn't much room in his house, I slept in the living room decorated by his own surfboards, which he called guns. The boards all appeared sharper than they needed to be, like they should have been called knives. He made a bed from the pull-out couch up against the wall, and since he didn't own a television and went to bed early every night, I watched the geckos climb the walls before I fell asleep. He woke early, even on the weekends, so as to get to the surf before the partiers. He trudged by the couch in the humid black before daybreak without saying so much as good morning. The geckos that still clung to the walls scattered and left me alone. Possibly he thought I was still asleep, but I didn't dare talk to him, just stared at the lifted seam of flesh on his face. His presence frightened me. My father was never so quiet, but in many ways, Jason was friendlier. He made my lunch every day before work, and even though he woke early on weekends for the surf, he bought me Koen sushi from Cammy's Market in the winter and malasadas from Leonard's Bakery when he went to town for the summer swells. He left me on the beach, where I had a treat and a book, and there was never any shortage of entertainment on the sand. In winter, when the swells were largest and the pro surfers from all over the world came into town, that's when I saw the most fights. The Ohana crew was a group of Hawaiian surfers that fought to maintain the respect and safety in the water. But they were more than just some water police, more than a brotherhood. They regulated surf contests, got their hands on money. They ran parties and were the connection for anything. They were the power. And when some surfer or tourist broke decorum surfing, they made sure that power was felt. Paradoxically, the leader was a mainlander at Hawley named Nathaniel Goldman, or Nasty Nate as he was known in the country. He was a really big dude, broad shoulders, short blonde hair, and his skin was the kind of red tan that us Howleys get when we think we're invincible to the sun. Publicly, he was lauded as champion of Hawaiian rights, the go-to organizer for any surf event in the country, and he made sure that the Hawaiians weren't nudged out of competitions, but everyone knew how he actually earned his place as the leader of the Ohana crew. Just like anywhere else, drugs, money, and guns. Not the most clever name, Nasty Nate, but guys like him don't find their originality in their nicknames, but in how they earn them. And the few times I saw while Jason was surfing, Nate found his way into plenty of fights, but what made Nate nasty was his obsession with hands, knowing a person couldn't make a living in the country or surf with him. When he wasn't armed, breaking hands involved smashing them with a rock that he found on the beach while either of the black-haired and muscular Ka'apana brothers, Ka'eo and Keolu, pinned the offenders down onto the packed dirt of the path. The Ohana crew gave Jason stink-eye when we cleared away, but it wasn't the same menacing stink-eye that they gave other Hollies. This one said they remembered, that they hated him. But our Hawaiian neighbors loved Jason. He was always helping fix a roof, unclog a sink or a toilet. For those who couldn't pay him, he learned to accept haupia cream pies from Mrs. K. Aloha or invitations to luau's with the alanas. He was gracious and always said thank you with that smile that amounted to little more than a curling. I acclimated to him. He brought me to one of the luau's at the alanas, and even now I can smell the sugary smoke from the pork. Pops Alana was a strong and fat man. Had to be over 300 pounds. He barked at Jason when I showed up, saying Jason was too good of a friend and that I would bring nothing but trouble. Jason only kindly explained that he was looking after me for a bit, but his thick fingers wrapped under my underarm and I couldn't help but imagine him torquing me the way he bent pipe in his backyard, should I ever misbehave. I feared him, but relished the respect that he earned me, and knew none of the big bone Alana boys, or the Alana girls, would ever bully me. They feared and obsessed over the same thing as me, his scar. Like most kids' stories, fantasy and rumor bounded the real story like the hard shell of a macadamia nut. But the unique part of the lore was a single unifying detail. Under that zipper of skin was a bullet. The same people that say my father died recreating the Hokulea's failed journey across the Pacific say that the bullet came from a heated confrontation out on the Ohana crew's pipeline. They say that an argument over priority on the waves ensued, but that Nasty Nate didn't have the Ka'apana brothers as backup. They say that Jason showed real backbone, but backbones can break in the country. The confrontation changed from shoving match on the sand to outright brawl in the parking lot. Nate earned himself a few frenetic seconds to get to his glove compartment, where he found his gun. Nate had an unbridled vibrancy in his eyes that bordered on insanity. Maybe it was the drugs. But his recklessness didn't deter Jason from charging at him, and Nate hurried off a shot that was lodged in his jaw. When I imagine Jason in this story, I can see his eyes turning that deep blue, that blue that is so dark that it hides all the dangers beneath. They say that the only thing that saved Jason was a famous Aussie surfer who showed up on the scene, refused to give Nate his violent privacy, and saved Jason's life. I never met that surfer, and knowing Jason now, I have a hard time believing that he would allow someone who saved his life to just walk right out, famous or not. I checked his car too, that blue Datsun pickup, and even though the car was rusting out, none of the rust could be confused with his blood. There's one other story, but the one that I could only overhear. No one had told it to me straight to my face, which I understand now. Beyond telling me a story that made Nasty Nate look bad, it had to be hard to tell a kid that his father was big into drugs, hung around with the bad guys too much. My pops had one of the most enviable gigs on the island, the bartending job at the Turtle Bay Hilton. His connections there enabled him to get Jason a job as a handyman, but those same connections also allowed Nasty Nate a way to deal to the tourists. tell my pops the room number, and drop the money in the tip bowl, and the guests would have however much cocaine they wanted in less than 20 minutes. Tips were occasionally large, so it worked perfectly. Only my pop started to treat the money like they were his tips. After all, he was a supplier. Turned out Nasty Nate didn't think so. Gave my dad a beating as warning. But when the theft persisted, Nate called the Ka'apana brothers to persuade my dad. That's when Jason heard word through Pops and Lana and went to Nate's house. I heard Pops and Lana say to others that night was the only time he'd seen Jason show his teeth when he smiled. No one ever said exactly what happened at Nate's house, only tossed around unreliable second-hand accounts from my dad saying that Jason risked his own life, his own hands, to save my dad from Nasty Nate. Only when Jason was running away with my pop did Nasty Nate hurt Jason with that lucky shot with his pistolette from the safety of his porch. Uncle Jason never validated or even acknowledged any of these stories, despite my frequent questioning. Even as I got older, even now, he still hasn't told me exactly what happened. He may have saved my pops, but Uncle Jason doesn't want to remember the risk he took to save my dad. For a time I thought he forgot, but I remembered time when he was in the privacy of the backyard working in the sun. He was bending pipe. His fingers would instinctively rub the scar before he would catch himself. His blue eyes focused on his hands, and that smile pulled up at the corners of his mouth, still hiding his teeth.
Thanks, Breen. Thank you. So, our next reader is Sarah Lowe, and Sarah is in her second year with the fiction concentration.
Her best road trip memory is sitting on a train alone from Naples to Nice, staring out at the turquoise sea, listening to Wild Horses by the Rolling Stones on a mixed tape her English boyfriend had made for her, and repeating a single thought in mind: I think I've got to marry this guy. And she did.
In Cambodia, a woman tried to sell Sarah her baby along with a t-shirt. But she likes you, the woman said. Sarah bought some bracelets and passed on the baby, though not without a heavy heart.
You may not know that people always respond to finding out that Sarah's an only child by saying, "But you're so nice."
And it's very true. One of the nicest MPW students, Sarah Lowe.
Thank you. I'm terrified of public speaking, but when Tom asked me, I thought, well, as you may know, Tom and Bruce are getting out of town permanently this summer, and so I thought I'm going to conquer my fear and dedicate this to them. This is called Timbuktu. I sat in a tire swing in my grandpa's forest, dreaming of Honolulu, Paris, London, and Naples. They were the faux postcards printed on my child-sized suitcase, a gift specifically designated for travel between my house and my grandparents' cabin. I imagined pineapples teetering atop women's heads and pizzas as big as cars. I tucked my dirty feet into the groove of the tire, stood up and propelled myself into the sunlight, glistening between outstretched arms of tree branches, imagining the jungles that awaited me. I just had to grow up and get the heck out of Indiana, and that's what I did. Going to college in Ohio was my first real conquest. I felt like a big shot driving across the state line to my own campus, my own dorm, my own state full of people that were not from Indiana. All of my friends had gone to Indiana State and the University of Indianapolis, but I broke free from those cornfields. Ohio. I had conquered the Midwest, and I was ready for the full-on thrill of wearing a black beret in Old Perry. Except all of those hours of daydreaming about cafes and turtlenecks, they didn't quite translate into great study habits. When I failed basic French, the study abroad counselor patted my hand and asked, "How about England?" My mother's hands trembled as she waved goodbye at the international gate of the airport. She knew I had the potential to never come back, and her only words of advice were, "Don't date any foreign boys." But I did, and I fell in love with an English filmmaker who spoke Norwegian and beautiful French. If there was ever a question that I'd move back to Indiana, 6 months in England squelched it. Dancing shoes dangled from my hand as I walked barefoot through London's Regent Street. I saw the twinkling lights of Paris reflected in the Seine at the stroke of midnight. And when my English boyfriend kissed me at that moment on Pont Neuf, I had to hang my head between my knees to stop from hyperventilating. I ordered pizza in Napoli and discovered that I love sardines. I saw Scotland and Ireland, Germany and Austria, Hungary and the Czech Republic. I saw a world bigger than I had ever dreamed, and I was never going back. Except that I kind of had to if I wanted to get my degree, so I flew back to Ohio with an Englishman in tow. My parents worried. I was home, but for how long? My mother fretted over future grandchildren that would live even farther than Timbuktu. But one person was excited, and in the week before I started school again, my grandpa drove from his cabin in southern Indiana, 3 hours up the center of the state, to visit me at my parents' house. He wanted to see my traveling pictures. We sat with my album, and he asked a lot of questions. He wanted to know what I thought of the train system in Berlin. He asked if I saw the Leaning Tower of Pisa. He wanted to know where I would go next, and then he showed me his albums. In the time I had spent growing up, my grandpa had traveled all over the world. In the 1970s, he'd ridden his motorcycle across 48 states. Now he wanted his feet to touch every country on this earth, having already managed to see half of them. I was 21 years old when he told me his goal, and I decided that day that I was going to beat him to it. I moved to London after graduation and found a flat with my Englishman. I worked for a children's book publisher, and he edited advertising reels. We saw more of Europe with every break we got and flew back to Indiana each Christmas, where my grandpa would take out his pictures to show us the places he'd been. China, Ecuador, Egypt, Russia, always someplace new, and he was zipping through them far faster than I could, with retirement giving him that competitor's advantage. When the Englishman and I got engaged, Grandpa said, "Well, how about that? Guess I'll be seeing you in England next year." But a rainy Indiana summer was way cheaper than rainy London, and Grandpa was there with his umbrella just the same. We planned a honeymoon in Singapore and Malaysia, but then the SARS virus hit. Our travel agent convinced us that Belize and Guatemala were between hurricane seasons, nice and cheap, and they were two countries where my grandpa hadn't been. So I checked them off my list, and I finally got to spread my arms out wide on an inner tube, floating down a potentially crocodile-filled river in the middle of the Belizean jungle. My grandpa was impressed. We returned with a couple bottles of the local beer and a handcrafted tribal mask to hang on the wall of our first house, not in London or Indiana, but in our brand new town of Berkeley, California. But then my grandma got sick. Cancer took one of her breasts, and she fought for survival most of the year. Grandpa stayed home to take care of her, but only because Grandma threatened to leave him if he didn't. With blood clots in his legs and a breathing apparatus he now needed at night, my grandpa declared his international traveling days at an end. I saw Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, but described the streets of Saigon to my grandpa in deeper detail than I'd ever before. How you step into the traffic slowly, breathing deeply, methodically, allowing motorbikes to whiz in front of you and in back of you, legs of passengers brushing your own, because if you hesitate, that's when you're in trouble in a city that has no stop signs. My grandpa had never seen Vietnam and never would. We spent most of the following Christmas break with my grandpa, watching him work iron in his blacksmith shop. He gave us each a shot of bourbon in our tea when we came in out of the cold, and encouraged my grandma's dog, Trudy, to snuggle up at our feet. We sat in his cabin in the woods with the snow coming down, and something felt different to me. I felt at peace, not restless. I felt at home in Indiana for maybe the first time in my life. Just because he'd sworn off planes didn't mean that my grandpa stopped traveling altogether. And in those cold weather days, he described to us the sunsets across the mountains of Shaman, New Mexico. Part of his world travels had been spent riding and repairing steam trains, and he wanted us to go with him in the summertime to see a train that still ran through the southwestern states. "You won't believe how it feels out here, so still and beautiful," my husband said, describing the inky skies and wide-open landscapes of daybreak. He was making a documentary about my grandpa and had driven out to New Mexico ahead of me. It's easier to think out here. You'll see. It will change you. But I didn't believe him. We'd been grinding out an existence in Los Angeles. I was eking the life out of myself during the day as a producer for Disney and driving across town at night to get my master's at USC. I guess you could say I wasn't looking around very much beyond the 110 and 5 freeways. With only 2 weeks of vacation time and 2 families to visit each year, Adventures became a deck chair with a nice big view of the weeds I hadn't pulled. But when I landed in Santa Fe, everything did change. The air was dry and my spirit felt malleable. I got in the rental car, my grandpa at the wheel, my husband in the back seat, their work clothes covered in dust, faces with big puppy-like grins. My husband wrapped his arms around my shoulders. As we drove away, my grandpa reached over and placed his hand on mine. "We sure are glad to see you," he said. And at that moment, I couldn't remember a time I had felt so loved in all my life. It was like coming home. On the drive to Shama, across the mesa and through the mountains, my grandpa told us the story of the power company strike in the early 80s, when he and my uncles took their idle days to clear a spot of land in a forest and build his cabin from the ground up. By the time we went back to work, the cabin was built, he said. And then he told us that in a couple of years he's going to sell it. My grandma had won the fight against cancer, but they feared it would return. We drove for a while in silence. They needed to move closer to town to retire from the upkeep of a home in the woods. We drove for a while in silence before he added, "It's time to move on." I wondered if it was time to move on too, and my husband started asking the same thing over the next few months. We'd been moving from city to city for 10 years, but hadn't found a home. Being with Grandpa, being in the mountains where the traffic noise is non-existent and no one rushes to do anything, that felt like home. My husband and I could live in any of the 50 states, Europe, Australia, or New Zealand, but we can't stop thinking about my grandpa's cabin and a permanent place to call our own. I pray that the cancer doesn't return and that the move into town will be a happy one for my grandparents. But I feel better knowing that I'll be close by. Because when my grandparents make that shift in their lives, my husband and I will be making a shift in ours too. I'm headed back home with a suitcase that's seen London, Paris, and Naples, Englishmen in tow. We're putting a down payment on a tire swing, a gravel driveway, and a cold water creek that reflects fireflies on hot summer nights. We're buying that cabin that my grandpa built and his 12 acres of woods, located just 30 minutes drive from an international airport. And when we decide to finally have children of our own, they will, to their grandparents' surprise, live a whole lot closer than Timbuktu.
Thanks, Sarah. That was great. Thank you. So any road trip stories you want to share?
I have one from Italy, keeping in vein with the whole European thing. We rented a car in Milan, terrible idea, and I had the map out with a pencil, just taking every turn, and we were so lost for hours that we finally needed a police escort to drive us to our hotel, which was really embarrassing. Do you have any good ones?
Oh, when I was little, I had an aunt and uncle that didn't have any kids yet, and my Uncle Jim and Aunt Nancy, and they would take, I was probably like 3, and my older sister was 5, and they would take us to Grandma and Grandpa's or into Chicago. I grew up in Iowa. And one day on the way back from Grandma and Grandpa's, after about an hour in the car, I always got car sick, and I puked all over my sister's feet. And so they pulled over, they cleaned it up, we stopped in the next town, got something to eat at lunch at Hot Sam's. So you remember Hot Sam's? It was a baked potato place. 10 minutes later, I threw up on her feet again. It was the worst road trip ever. Hot Sam's.
Okay.
Never again.
So our final student reader of tonight is Russell Nakamura. He is in his 3rd year in the program with a fiction concentration.
Russell's favorite travel memory was hopping out of the car to take pictures of a bear. Then he realized he was standing 15 feet away from a bear.
He once drove to the bayou outside of New Orleans to go bow fishing, which is fishing with a bow and arrow. He stopped because, well, who wouldn't want to go fishing with a bow and arrow?
And you may not know this, but Russell does not believe in expiration dates.
Introducing Russell Nakamura.
How's everyone doing? Hey, YouTube. I've actually got two pieces, and I hope I won't run long. You can just kind of give me the warning, I guess. And the first piece is not so much a road trip as it is just a incident that happened to me and the guys when we were out in Costa Rica, so try not to judge too much. I didn't rehearse this either, so. The two girls walked away quickly, arm in arm, shoulders hunched, eyes to the ground 30 yards ahead in the night blackness fragmented by crude Tamarindo streetlights. A moment's hesitation to be 50 yards. I pulled Luke in the neck, bringing his ear close. "We've got to catch up," I said. His wilting eyes and garbled speech indicated he wasn't of any mind or reason. Below the stairs, stray dogs skidded across the dirt road. Luke wandered into an empty lot. I couldn't see exactly where it was in the darkness. Truth be told, I hadn't been to this part of town in daylight. We had left the bar and were now somewhere between the surfers' hostel and a row of doorless restaurants near the Strand clustered together like kiosks at a county fair. Luke stumbled near a tarpaulin-covered fence. We stood beneath the shadows of tall objects resembling nothing like trees. I suspected we'd entered a construction site, and I called to Luke and headed towards the lot's opposite end where a dim light revealed a path to the road. It was dusty and the tropical heat stuck the shirt fabric to my chest, and I immediately regretted wearing jeans. We had to get moving. The girls had escaped from sight, but if we kept to the road, we'd return to Hotel Deria where we were all staying. I sensed Cheryl, the blonde, was tired and perhaps a bit fed up. Christy was being a good friend. This would require some clemency on their part. But I was willing to roll the dice. After all, we were on vacation. Rules are different when you're on vacation. Luke was a few steps behind me. Sure, he'd had a drink or 10, but I'd never known him to do anything stupid like climb a gate or break a window. So I walked, speaking aloud so he'd know in which direction to follow. The fence shook. I turned and saw he'd maneuvered his way around it. Then blue lights started flashing. From the darkness, a yellow and white van the size of an ice cream truck emerged with high beams on. 4 men in uniform hopped out its sides brandishing firearms. And not the standard issue 9mm Berettas you'd expect of American peacekeepers, no. These were German MP5s, complete with banana clips and shoulder straps. An officer shouted at me. "I don't understand what you're saying," I said hastily. I reached for my pockets for identification. He shouted again and gestured for me to face the vehicle, and I then realized it probably wasn't wise to scramble for my pockets when someone's pointing a gun at you. "No habla español," I uttered. I turned to Luke, who was searching for a place to lean. "Come here," I mouthed. He placed his hands at the vehicle's hood. "You got that copy of the passport?" I whispered, recalling guidebooks that had advised us to have one on us at all times. His eyes were like glass. I may as well have asked if he wanted to sock a monkey in the face. The officers frisked us and started conferring with one another in Spanish. I wondered whether what we'd done was illegal. I wondered if I had the money for an adequate bribe. Mostly I wondered how long it'd be through the night before anyone discovered that Luke and I had been thrown into some Costa Rican prison. Okay, so I have this next piece is actually from my thesis, which is a novel that touches on Asian American folklore. It's about 2 Japanese orphans who live in a small town called Hartswald in the mountains. Now, I want to give a little shout out to Judith Freeman, who's here. She's my advisor and probably my only link to the MPW this year. Thanks for coming out to support me, Judith. This scene has the elder orphan Madeline, who's 16, searching the woods for her little brother Kai, who's gone missing just before a snowstorm. And Madeline's just left Claire, who's urged her not to go. Claire is the woman who used to take care of them when they were really young, but then suddenly left town. Now it's 7 years later and she's come back. Madeline feels a lot of anger towards Claire in this scene because of just abandonment and other issues. But what she doesn't know is that Claire is the person responsible for her mother's death. Okay, so this is the excerpt from chapter 9. She didn't have memories of her mother. She'd been missing for so long, and most of town had agreed it had been the forest that had taken her. Part of Madeline believed she was not meant for this earth, not meant to age or wither away, although she had some ideas of what her mother had been like. Humble, Maybe that was the wrong word. Shy? Selfless? Submissive? No, that was wrong. Just historically typical of Japanese women. No, her mother had just been shy, withdrawn, as if she didn't reside in this world. And so, as Madeline walked through ankle-deep snow, walking with greater intention, she could sense her mother here now in the forest, in the realm of spirits. It was dim among the trees, sugar pines. She could tell from their hive-like cones. The snow around her lay untouched, smooth as though the woods were filled with richly poured cream. Kai's footprints led below branches. Why did he go this way? Branches were too low, even for him, just a few feet off the snow. Then, under a deadfall. He couldn't fit there, not without crawling. Maybe these weren't his tracks anymore. No, they had to be. She decided she would circumvent the deadfall. And she strayed from the trail only long enough to get around that tree trunk and these prickly shrubs. The ground dipped, a gully, water somewhere, running. She was farther off the trail now, but still just left of the deadfall, 40 feet. Then the ground gave, water. Beneath her foot was a length of creek. Her boot was wet. It would get to her socks, and then she couldn't wear them, and then she'd have to go without socks. Maybe. These are winter boots, after all. A bird perched on a branch, palm-sized with fine black head feathers. It didn't twitch like she expected the bird to twitch or turn, hop or flutter like a small bird does. It just stared. Maybe it was a figurine. Taxidermy. But for whom? She then looked up through the clearing of canopy. The sky was blue. The sky was gray. Winds were shifting. Maybe the bird was frozen. It wasn't that hard to fathom. Maybe someone had tied its little feet down with string before the last storm blew in, condemning it to freeze. And if so, did it cry? What incits a bird to cry except for dying? It hopped and flew away. Kai's footprints were gone. Madeline thought she'd come around in a half circle, but they were gone. Puzzled, she locked her eyes under the tree. There was smooth bark, needles sticky on limbs like long, flat hairs, sap, resin, frost. Was it possible? Of course she could go back, follow her own prints back to the trail, but could it be possible? The woods had a will of its own. Could her brother's footprints have gotten erased and repressed by something deliberately to stray her? Erased, surely with a snowfall from branches, but repressed. By what? What could be its intention? What could be willing to stray her intentionally to? But she could go back. It was safer. There was plenty of light, and the wind was calm, and it wasn't that cold, not yet anyway. And no, she'd come this far. She had to look for Kai. She wasn't going home empty-handed. Not to Clara. Clara Barton. She had taken her uncle's name back. Clara Barton Warner. Well, what did that matter anymore? The last Madeline had seen the woman, her name was on its way back to something else. McMinn. Madeline had not thought of Clara Barton for years. She wanted to say 7, in fact, even though there was, admittedly, a short while she had thought now and then of Clara Barton after she'd gone. Days in her room with animals at her pillows, roses in the window, and Clara's potted blue geranium on the sill dying that little Madeline had constantly watered, the way a child might futilely endeavor to resuscitate a goldfish fallen from its bowl. Live! Live! It went this way for a year. So, 6. She was almost 10 then. Clara was just 21 and had met a businessman, a boy at a business school with a family in trucking, Charlie McMinn, Jr. Well, at least Madeline recalled he was a junior. So Clara went off to marry and maybe go to college and become a teacher in California. It all sounded fine. But it all had happened so rapidly and ended just as rapidly, she later heard. In fact, it had all been so abrupt that it came to seem plausible that maybe Clara had left only because she had not really wanted to spend her afternoons reading and playing and cooking with them. Understandable. But then Madeline supposed maybe she had said something or done something, although there was nothing she could put a finger on. They never had an outright fight, but maybe she had done something, or many things minuscule or paramount to turn that notion in Clara's mind, that notion that maybe perhaps Clara was meant for a life far away from Hartswell, away from any life Madeline and her brother could have offered. Maybe Clara hadn't wanted to care for Madeline. Maybe that was true for quite a while. Maybe there was some sense of obligation, a duty even. Clara drilled all those political notions into Madeline's head anyway, the Japanese, the relocation, injustice. Maybe the 2 years Clara had spent raising her in Kai was some form of ascetic flagellation, something she had never wanted to do but did anyway because it was right and good and just. Not for love, penance. Until she'd had enough and it was time to run. So now, 7 years later, Clara's return to Hartswald might still be, in fact, that very same thing, penance. She hadn't come back to love Madeline. She was trying to heal herself. At least Beth Clausen kept a certain distance when she came to the house to give her lessons. Beth Clausen, who was always good and friendly, a cordial instructor who cared deeply about their welfare, but who also never blew cool air on her soup when it was hot, held her hand when she couldn't sleep. Beth wouldn't stay the night. She would never be so cruel. Madeline decided she couldn't let Clara Barton Warner be cruel, and bore her way back in. Then a voice. It came from her left, like a woodwind behind a closed door. But it had to be false. It had to. Trees would absorb such a sound. It wasn't a vibration, more like someone standing off in dead air. Madeline, it said, help. Thank you.
Well, thank you again to all of our student readers tonight. Thank you. You did a great job. Thank you for reading. Amy Gerstler is a writer of poetry, nonfiction, journalism, a smidge of fiction, and hybrid pieces. Her book, Dearest Creature, was named New York Times Book Review Notable Book of the Year and was shortlisted for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in Poetry.
Her previous 12 books include Ghost Girl, Medicine, Crown of Weeds, which won a California Book Award, Nerve Storm, and Bitter Angel, which won a National Book Critics Circle Award in Poetry.
She has her BA from Pitzer College and an MFA from Bennington College. And in addition to teaching in USC's MPW program, she teaches in the Fine Arts graduate program. And she also teaches at the Bennington Writing Seminars.
Amy's favorite road trip memory is standing on the lip of the Grand Canyon in a light snow with her best friend from college.
On her way to Northern California via 395, Amy once stopped at a roadside stand that sold elk jerky, bison jerky, etc. jerky, because she finds jerky mildly, morbidly interesting.
You may not know that 4 of Amy's heroes are Florence Nightingale, Julia Child, Sigmund Freud, and Virginia Woolf.
And with great joy, we introduce to you Amy Gerstler.
Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to have been asked to read with these illustrious and talented students. And I do believe that our host and co-host, soon to be host, when the mantle is handed over upon graduation of Tom, don't you think they should have their own talk show? I think that some of these late night people should be shaken in their boots. So we've heard some very cool prose set in all kinds of different places and mindscapes, and now we're going to digress to a little poetry. This is a small sort of spring prayer, since although you can't tell by the weather lately, it is officially spring. We're going to have some prayers, and then we're going to move into sex. Although those things have a lot of cross-pollination, don't you think? Anyway, this little prayer is called Ember Days. Dear Maker, I've failed, lost my tongue. Put words back in my mouth again, or blackberries maybe, and concepts back in my head. Lead me down into your backyard, which never ceases, with its apricots and onyx, its green breath and feces, being Eden. Okay, so a little more prayers before the sex. This one, I was reading about Jewish prayers, and I learned that there's one that Orthodox Jews say when they first wake up in the morning, before they get out of bed, basically thanking God for not having sort of killed them during the night, which I thought was a very good idea. So I tried to write a kind of secondhand version of that. So this is called Fall on Your Knees. On waking, if seized by an urge to munch shrubs, give in. Swing your legs over the lee side of the bed. What self-appointed princess owns these pink velvet slippers? Tromp into the garden and graze while you may. Chew dew-bejeweled weeds till they complain. Rivers will swallow you, stupid human, for turning them to syrup. Thirsty birds who flicker in huge eucalyptus, how will you punish us? Coffee, ignite my coward mind, ever ready to flee. Make her stay, or at least let me see her again. Fellow men, let your leaky perfection spur me to worship as you bash galvanized cans in symphonic impact this trash day. Speak to me sweetly of adversity's value. And you, gaggle of errant selves, flock of motley buzzards, population ever-changing, scavenge that crash site, this bed, as I sip this morning's cocktail, an eye-opener after last night's revels. Bitters mixed with curds of cloud. Fans of waking up poems. You too can write one or a waking up prose. So now we're moving into the transition where the prayers and the sex merge. Someone was actually doing an anthology of prayers before sex, and they asked me to write something for it, and I did, and then it went the way of many projects and never saw the light of day, sadly, because it sounded like rather narrow, if perhaps a good idea. Maybe before and after would stretch it a little, But anyway, this is imaginatively called Prayer Before Sex. This writhing and thrustings designed to distract us from brooding about death. But who can forget that all we prize is but lent to us anyway? The length of our days, our contracting attention spans, the world spun around us and the universe pulsing within. The penis, the liver, errant patches of hair, the spirit housed in its aching meat. Let all flesh bless the stumbling, numbered breaths, the urges, the bloody smells, long afternoons in foreign hotels, a premonition of children. Let those who sleep in the dust guffaw at our antics, or just lie silent till our half-lives elapse. We bed down and rise up as often as we can. Fireflies encircled her head as she stood on the porch at twilight. Only this act is real. Only her. Only me. My tremblings during the delivery of this poem reminded me of something that I wanted to say in my between poem banter, which is, I think we should have a small hand for the bravery of the students who read tonight. It is scary to do this. And I don't know if for some of them it was their very first reading, but I'm very moved by the idea of being at somebody's very first reading. So if I had something to make a toast with, here, toast you with the microphone. This next poem, now we're totally moving into the sex area, but just shortly, for a short period of time. These are the captions for a silent porn film that takes place in prehistoric times. So these are, cave people. But because they're captions in the silent film, smells are included, as you'll see. So this is called prehistoric porn film. Thighs sticky, leakage streaked, matted fur, meaty reek, grooming ruse, she has fleas. His hair stinks of burnt dirt, spectral whiffs of afterbirth, twig crack, muzzle cuff, snuffling licks, nuzzle shove, pinned down, kicking, legs entwining, mulch scuffle, bite marks, whining, genitals wild dialect, slick dizzy intersect, changing forms, tusks and horns and beaks are seen at seizure's peak. Jerking squirt, quickly spent, kissing's not invented yet. Fans of prehistoric sex, cool. Okay, I don't know, I imagine that I am not alone in the experience I'm about to describe, because many people here are writers, that you suffer from dictionary distraction, where you go to look something up in a dictionary and you get waylaid by a strange, interesting word that maybe starts with the same letter and totally forget what you were supposed to be looking up. So I found this word that way. Does anyone know what the word merry thought, M-E-R-R-Y-T-H-O-U-G-H-T means? Because I didn't. It's an old word, and it means a bird's wishbone, or the wishbone. I guess we have them too. And I guess it came from the idea that the merry thought was the lovely wish that you would make when you broke the wishbone, and then it came to mean the actual bone. So this is the title of this poem, Merry Thought. No, I corrected the rosy-cheeked nurse. I am the wife, and she is the mistress. He died stoned out of his mind as we wept farewells and caressed the thin white hairlip scar connecting his left nostril to his bristly upper lip. Now he's part of that which always is, survived by me and my silent sister in crimes of trampled convention. Well, not trampled exactly, more like polka'd upon. Some days I'm almost a man, barking harsh laughs, my anger an incandescent brand of valor. The sight of this slight woman, auburn hair fanned out on pillows, is enough to flush floods of hummingbirds from the aviary just below my stomach. And boy, those hummingbirds are hungry. The reckless joys of maidenhood uppermost in our minds, we made lists during bedside vigils, while he drifted, of things we could do together, besides sex, after the man in whose clasp we had melded was gone. Then we each kissed his wishbone. His neck smelled of coarse-milled peasanty bread, and left him, forever, to the grave ministrations of the raven-haired young nurse, now orphaned, whose touch he had loved so much. Okay, now I think we're moving out of sex into whining, which I know you'll enjoy, because you don't get enough of it in your regular life. This is called Extracts from the Consoler's Handbook. So the conceit of this, or the main idea behind it, if it can be said to be an idea, is the idea that there's a handbook for people who are professional consolers, and this is a few pages. Sleepless grief must rise quietly twice a night to change its soaked pajamas. Submissive grief, a prizefighter's fist lodged in its throat, sips the offered broth to be polite, spits into its napkin the minute you look away. After fucking in the underbrush, jealous fury and high-minded grief walk slowly home, towards opposite ends of town, dead leaves in their hair. Impatient grief braids and unbraids the tablecloth fringe, taps out Morse code with its loafer toe, sending messages to the newly dead. The body's a bear trap. while enduring the fat pastor's kindly insights and pouring him more coffee. Root cellar grief burrows in a crawl space beneath its former home. This species of grief prefers to cower among abandoned skunk nests and home-canned tomatoes botulism has claimed, never wipes its feet, and mounts the stairs into its well-lit house, where casseroles featuring melted cheese are being reheated, and children are having their baths. Sufferers from volcanic grief never enjoy life aright again, till the lava has cooled and taken on wondrous blackened forms. Long past midnight, solitary grief may be relieved by the loud sounds of lively mice banging around inside a cold stove. Another odd, but there were a lot of poems about this theme for an anthology, was an anthology of breakup poems. So this is one of those, and it's called Dusk. Dear, I can't subsist on this diet, really more of a fast. Celery seed and a soft word every other month, any longer. Is that blood on your pillowcase or another girl's lipstick? I want you to know I've had such unalloyed joy over the past several decades, smelling your hair and petting your sweat-beaded feet while you were asleep. It was far sweeter than I ever thought possible. But my ancestors are welling up in me now and keep nudging me towards the door. Bells are rung, harps are played, recessional music. We both know the theater will close in a few minutes. If you had been more attentive or better pretender, I could have run on fumes for a few more years, sipping snowmelt, remaining quite high on it. Let the record show I recited prayers for your perpetual ascension and good health as I laid this note in its frozen envelope on your desk and left, taking both dogs, the teal parakeet and the black cat, with me. They got custody of our love. Okay, two more. So you're very much in the home stretch. This is called Pale Queen. Her sovereignty, your poverty, her mocha-nippled majesty, all her faults, those small assaults, her kisses which taste of ancient faiths. Pray don't reproach her, imprisoned as she is in her latest incarnation, dazed by pent-up scents that waft from her hair as she unwinds it at night. When she asks, "Do I look like a harlot in this dress?" insist that's ridiculous. When she inquires if pin curls make her a dead ringer for some medieval Spanish rabbi, better not laugh if you value this unnatural, utterly lovely woman who drowned her child in a pond 5 lives ago. Such was the distracted state of her mind. I cannot pray and can never repent. Okay, last poem. I tried to pick a cheerful one because it is, after all, supposed to be spring soon. So my mother wanted to be an opera singer, and we had a lot of books full of opera synopses around the house, so that, because they're usually sung in not English, you are supposed to read and kind of know the synopsis, and then you can go to the opera and kind of get what's going on. So I wrote an opera synopsis. It's kind of a pastoral opera, so this is called Pastoral Opera Synopsis. As the curtain rises, a tiny, unassuming weed sings a haunting song. Alas, my seed pods are lost to the wind. A sputtering lamp is about to go out as a cattle breeder sits on his milking stool in the barn, inhaling the evening's cool air, thumbing through a catalog depicting various bulls. He's looking for a mate for Vanilla, his favorite heifer, and they croon a charming duet, "Oh, Fragrant Hay." Outside, destruction of the farmer's crops by locusts is averted as monarch butterflies swarm and lead their fellow insects to new feeding grounds. Chirp on, winged comrades. Wild violets at the pasture's edge tempt the lowing cows, whose bells clank as they amble home to nibble their tender leaves, paying gracious homage to the food chain. By our aid, the stars are weighed. All life forms join in rousing chorus as the curtain descends. Thank you for listening.
I want to see that opera. That's great. Well, thanks again to Justin, Erin, Breen, Sarah, Russell, and Amy. You all were great. Thank you very much. And a thank you to Damon, who is here tonight recording for USC. And all of the recent readings are back up on YouTube, so check out the Master Professional Writing YouTube page. And a thank you as well to the staff, to Noelle and the rest of the staff here at Skylight. Please support Skylight Books. We have some of Amy's books for sale up here. There's Ghost Girl, Medicine, Crown of Weeds. And she'd be happy to sign them for you if you purchased one. But please support our local bookstores.
Our next event will be Friday, April 15th, Tax Day, at Barnes & Noble's at the Grove, and the theme is Death and Taxes. And our special faculty reader will be M.G. Lord.
So thank you again for coming out tonight. Please stick around, have some refreshments, and don't forget to check the Facebook page for MPW about the coming agents panel and the other events in the near future. Thank you very much for coming out.
Thank you.